Have you ever wondered about your grandparents, your great grandparents? Well, if you have, you're not alone. My guest today is Terrence Franklin. He is a lawyer, a writer, and a historian, and he is the creator of stories and media projects called The Last Will of Lucy Sutton. And this is a fascinating project by this brilliant Harvard trained lawyer that traces his roots back to the early 1800s and the discoveries that he makes along the way as he meets his great grandmother, Lucy Sutton. More about Terry Franklin and Lucy Sutton, her 8 kids, and her 6 grandkids, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Good morning and welcome. I'm going to call you Terry instead of Terrence. So good to sit down with you and to have this conversation about this amazing project that you've been working on. So first, let me just say congratulations.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Lucy Sutton, I mean, you're the creator of this story, this amazing story, and these media projects related to the life of Lucy Sutton. So, I know in your, what I'll call your day job, you are an estate and trust attorney, one of the best in the city of Los Angeles. We happen to be classmates from Harvard. But talk to me about how you got into this storytelling, this, using this other part of your brain to tell stories about your ancestors.
Well, I've always had some interest in trying to do things that are creative, but I think for some, like a lot of people, I thought, I got to do something that's going to get me a job and get me paid. So I've always focused on trying to get a job in law, and that was always my dream and my goal, without a specific place that I wanted to go in particular. Somehow I managed to stumble on trust and estate litigation, which seemed sort of random at the time. But now looking back, I realized this was really part of my destiny, that if I hadn't chosen this particular practice area, that I would not have been able to unlock the mystery of my ancestors' story and to be able to share it with the world. So it's unfolded like this piece of my destiny.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how that happens, right? When you're in law school, you don't quite know what area of law you want to go into, and then you get into an area and you realize, how many tentacles that particular area of law may have. So let's dive into, you're a trust and estates litigation attorney, very specialized. Trust and estates meaning dealing with folks' wills and, how they plan for how their assets will be passed down when they die. So
Right.
how did you stumble, if it was a stumble, maybe it was more intentional, on this story of your ancestors?
Sure. So I'd been doing trust and estate litigation for about a quarter of a century, never thinking about this story when my great aunt was turning 100, and her name was Aunt Viola. She was like the family matriarch, and everybody respected her and loved her. She'd walked 4 miles each way to get her degree from Southern Illinois University, and she married a Tuskegee Airman, and she helped to train the children of Tuskegee Airmen before their fathers shipped off to World War II. But she was turning 100 in 2014, and I wanted to do something special to recognize how significant she was in our family as a matriarch. And I remembered that I'd seen back in 2001 some old family reunion materials that included a little typed up portion of an excerpt that somebody had researched in the 1980s, and they typed it up in a cursive font. I'm sure some of us are old enough to remember what a cursive font is. But they were trying to create the idea of a handwritten document. And all we had was this little excerpt that said, John Sutton, being of sound mind but infirm in body, hereby proclaims he owns the following property. To wit, a mulatto slave Lucy, aged about 45, and her 8 children and 6 grandchildren, all listed by name and age. And when I saw that, in 2001, I sort of thought, I'd love to try to track that down, but I just didn't have the wherewithal or the means or even the ability to connect with that information. But when my great aunt was turning 100, by that time I was a fellow in the American College of Trust and Estate Counsel, so I had contacts across the country that I could reach out to, including to Jacksonville, which is where the will was recorded. And I called up lawyers and I said, hey, I'm trying to find this will from 1846 of my great-great-great-great-grandfather. And the first thing I got back was, there was the Great Fire of Jacksonville of 1901 that destroyed everything. You're never going to find it. And then a paralegal heard my story and she said, let me see what I can do. And she managed to track it down for me.
Well, let me ask you this, Terry. The excerpt that you found in 2001, who had written that? Who had typed that out?
Some relative whose name I don't know had done some research and had gone to Southern Illinois and had found this copy, because according to the excerpt, there was a copy that was recorded in Southern Illinois where the family settled. There was a copy that was recorded in Ware County, Georgia, where the family had lived before, and the original was in Jacksonville, Florida, which is where the family left from. So it was this connection of human beings in our family whose names I don't even know that helped to lead me to this destiny.
So this random paralegal hears your story, decides that, she wants to help you. And so was she able to actually find the original will that John Sutton wrote?
That's the amazing thing. She let me know that she'd seen a John Sutton file. She couldn't be sure if it was the right one. And she said, but I'll see what I can do, because I think she was engaged by the story of my great aunt and how meaningful she was for our family. And then a couple days later, as we was just about to prepare to go back to the Midwest for my great aunt's celebration, I got this email from this paralegal, Ann, and she said, we found it. It's the right John Sutton file. And what do you want us to do? And I said, take a picture. And so she sends me these images that come across through the internet, and it's like across 170 years of time and across the country comes these images of, this careful cursive script on sepia paper, and then this vibrant red wax seal that had somehow still survived over 170 years, so I could have this access to these documents. So this was just like mind-blowing, and that really opened the door to this process of me doing research and digging deeper and trying to understand the significance of the will, both for my family and what it says about America and about what we have the capacity to do as human beings.
So tell us, who was John Sutton? Because now you can make the connection, and you were able to do some deeper research on John. So who was John?
So John was a white farmer in Jacksonville, Florida. He had 4 brothers. Absalom, Moses, David, and Shadrach was his youngest brother.
Very religious family, obviously.
Yes, and they all lived in Georgia, and it turns out that John had a good friend whose name was Ezekiel Adams, who owned Lucy, and Lucy was, he was also her father. Ezekiel Adams was also the father of Lucy. But when Ezekiel died, he had a son who was a year younger than Lucy, who was Lucy's white half-brother, but he was too young to inherit property himself. John became the guardian for young William Adams, and because he was William Adams' guardian, anything that William owned, John owned. And that's how John came to own Lucy. She was...
So hold on a second. So Lucy's father is this white slave owner.
Yep.
And who was Lucy's mother?
Lucy's mother, we don't know exactly who Lucy's mother was. In fact, I have a dream of pursuing a documentary project to truly understand who Lucy's mother was. But what we know about her, what we can assume about her, is that she was, brought over from Africa, probably, and that she was probably, a young teenager when Ezekiel Adams purchased her. Obviously, raped her because there's no consent. And so Lucy was born in, I think, 1801. And a couple of years later, her white father, Ezekiel Adams, had a white child named William, who was Lucy's younger white half-brother,
right,
who owned her, which is like this bizarre thing that, when we start talking about human beings owning one another and your...
As property, the young kid goes to John, and then the slave that he would have inherited if he was old enough goes with him. So when they get to John's home, property, how does John treat Lucy?
That's a good question, because he's nearly 30 years older than she is. And this is, one of these situations where He obviously has, as it turns out, 8 children with Lucy, and they have 6 grandchildren together, and they're together for 30 years.
Oh, wait a minute. So he takes Lucy as like a girlfriend, a side piece? Because we know he doesn't marry her, right?
Right. And, that's really one of the core questions that has bugged me from the very beginning. Because when I went back to the family reunion, I shared this information with my family, and I wondered whether we should include the name Sutton with our family reunion name. And one young cousin of mine said, why would we choose to include the name of somebody who raped our ancestor? And I had to pause and think about that for a minute. And I said, well, what we do know is that ultimately John did set her free, along with their 8 kids and 6 grandkids in this will. And we also know that Lucy ultimately used the name Sutton as well. But what is this relationship? There was no way that, he owned her. Let's start with that.
He was 30 years older, so about how old do you know?
So Lucy was 45 in 1846 when John did the will, and John was 75 probably. So in his will, he said, I'm old and I'm sick, but I have this property, mulatto slave, Lucy, age 45.
But do you know how old Lucy was when she first arrived at the Sutton property?
When she first arrived, she was about 15, 16.
Oh, man. So
Yeah.
this 45-year-old man at the time is raping, sexually assaulting this 15, 16-year-old teenager.
And this is the world of America, of antebellum South, and what do you do as Lucy when you're in this situation? You have no control over this. You are owned by someone, and you have to go where they go. And how do you try to make the most of this situation, knowing that you are essentially trapped in this set of circumstances?
8 children.
8 children. Wow. 8 children over the course of, between, I'm trying to think of, can't do the math fast enough, but they had 8 children together over 20-something years. But somehow, I think she made John see her humanity. I think the fact, what is it that would make a white man in 1846, who has all the powers and privileges of a white man of his time, make a decision to set free these people? Why would he do that? And that's part of what I've been trying to understand, And I can't speak for him, really, because I've never been a white man in a country that was formed by white men looking out for white men's interests without any regard for my interests or women's interests or black women. But I have been loved by black women. I have black mothers and a black ex-wife and daughters, and I know what it feels like to be loved by black women, and I know that they will do whatever they have to do to protect their families and to look out for their interests. So I know that Lucy was determined to make sure that her children would see a world of freedom that she'd never seen herself. And so somehow she got John to make sure that he was going to set them free. And that's what happened in the end, even though his brother ended up challenging the will.
Do you know, Terry, at the time that John was holding Lucy as his property as a slave, did he have other slaves?
As far as we know, other than Lucy and her 8 children and ultimately 6 grandchildren, he didn't own any other slaves. Okay. The other thing that's interesting is that the will doesn't indicate that he had any white family or white children. So again, I think
he was married. Did he have a white wife at the time?
He did not have a white wife. So in some way, I think they created a kind of family, despite the fact that there is no consent in this arrangement. Mm-hmm. And I think probably like a lot of other black women who have dealt with situations, you make the most of it. And you have these children, and you love your children. And somehow, I think John saw those children, and departing from what most white men would have done at that time, he developed feelings that made sure that they were going to be free. Because as I dug deeper and deeper into the story, and ultimately finding the transcript from the trial of the will contest, I learned that John had made efforts that were sort of extraordinary for his time to make sure that the family would be free after he died.
Okay, so here it is. You are a trust litigator.
Right.
And in this story, there is a litigation, like, the ultimate litigation happens because the younger half brother of Lucy, Ezekiel Adams, challenges the will.
Actually, it was John's youngest brother, Shadrach.
Oh, John's brother, not Lucy's half brother.
No, John's brother, Shadrach, challenged the will.
Okay.
And what's neat about Lucy's half brother, William Adams, is that John made him the executor of the estate. So John knew that Lucy's white half brother would make sure that Lucy and her family made it to Illinois. And in fact, William Adams traveled with them from Jacksonville through New Orleans, up the Mississippi to Illinois, and then went back to Florida. Because again, I think William Adams, these people did something that was strange. I think he thought of Lucy as a sister in a way that most white men would probably not have thought of their half, of their black enslaved siblings.
Right.
But William Adams,
it's John's brother because he wants to inherit Lucy and her 8 children as his property.
They're valuable people, after John dies, or, once John dies, Shadrach comes around, coming down from Georgia, and he's like, Lucy is probably worth $800. Each of the sons are probably $1,000 each. And I can not only have them and own them and sell them and trade them, I can rape the women. This is the reality of slavery in America. And so Shadrach, after John dies, claims that John was too old, too sick, too drunk, that he was plied with alcohol and ardent spirits to get him to do the will.
Now, did you actually find the legal documents that Shadrach filed?
That's the incredibly crazy part of this story is after I initially saw those images and through a set of mystical experiences that brought me to Jacksonville, Florida, because I was there for a Trust and Estates Lawyers Conference, my now husband, then partner, and I drove up to Jacksonville. We went into the courthouse. We saw the documents in my own hands and opened the file. It was like the size of a little lady's clutch purse. And I opened up this file and I was expecting to see the will, but there's like 40-something pages in there. And instead of being excited at the moment when I would be able to put my finger on that X that my great-great-great-great-grandfather had made that set us free, I thought I was going to have this emotional release. And instead I'm going, I'm a trust and estates litigator. What are these other pages in this file? I'm like flipping through and I go, oh my gosh. I had imagined before I went there, because I was so animated by uncovering the existence of this will that set my family free, that I was determined to share this story. And so I started outlining a novel that was going to tell this story. And I decided to make up a brother for John, because I didn't know at the time that John had any brothers. I made up a brother for him, and I called him Eustace because it seemed like a good old-timey name. And I said, Eustace challenged the will and argues that that the will is invalid. When I actually go and open the file,
special Scott Turow version of this story, and you had no clue that there was a brother,
no
and there
conscious
was a challenge to the will.
I had no conscious clue. Obviously, there's something in my DNA and my experience, that in my ancestors living in me, that told me that this story needed to be told. So when I go there and I open the file and I look up, and Jeffrey actually captured on video the moment when I say, oh my God, my novel just became reality because there really was a brother. And instead of the old-timey name of Eustace that I picked for him, his name was Shadrach. So how Old Testament can you get, right?
Yeah, right. Okay, so now Shadrach is contesting the will that John left, freeing Lucy. Did Lucy have an attorney?
So here's there's a slight divergence between the reality as we know it to be and the story that we're telling. The fact is that Lucy and the family made it to Illinois in December of 1846. And as far as I know, they never came back. They stayed there and they were safe and secure. Okay. The actual trial of the will contest didn't happen until a couple of months later, so March of 1847, while they were already in Illinois. this trial was playing out in Jacksonville, Florida. And there was a testimony of the drafting lawyer, and the testimony was recorded in a transcript of the trial. The transcript of the trial was the judge's handwritten notes. So Judge William F. Crabtree, again, another name that I could not have made up, presided over the trial. And according to his trial testimony, the transcript of the Gregory Yale was the lawyer. And Gregory Yale testified that John had an appointment to come into town. It was a two-day horse ride into Jacksonville, but John was too sick to go into the town. So Gregory Yale rode out to the house where he was greeted by John's sons, not his slaves, John's sons. And the family served him dinner. And he sat down and talked to John and to the family, and they explained that they had lived in Georgia before and that they had moved 100 miles with some 400 cows from Georgia to Florida because John thought he could set them free in Florida. And when they got to Florida, they found out that there was a statute in Florida that said you can't just set black people free. If you're going to set somebody free in Florida, you have to pay a $200 fine per person set free. You have to post a bond for their value, lest they become a burden on the people of the state of Florida. And they have to leave within 30 days. So you really couldn't even set them free, even if you had a desire, a true, valid desire to set them free. And that's what John wanted to do, as far as we could tell from the documents, from the transcript. Right. And one of the fascinating things that's in the transcript is that the drafting lawyer, Gregory Yale, says that Lucy spoke to him. And she said that Shadrach had always threatened that he would beat them if he ever came to own them. So that was her expression of her urgency and her desire for protection of her family, that once John was gone, this man who was 30 years older than her, who she knew was sick and dying, they had to get the heck out of Jacksonville.
To get away from this brother whose motives were to own and then abuse them. Exactly. Okay, so what was the outcome of the trial?
So the outcome of the trial, on March 10th, 1847, Judge Crabtree banged the gavel and entered his final decree, upholding the will, overruling Shadrach's contest, and ordering Shadrach to pay $28.08 in court costs. So we have this victory in a world that we assume that everything is going to go the wrong way.
Do you know, Terry, in that era, this 1800s, if Shadrach had won, would there have been jurisdiction for that judge to send out a marshal or some law enforcement type to another state to bring Lucy and the kids back? Was that the law at that time? Do you know?
I think the official Fugitive Slave Act wasn't passed until a little bit later. And so at this time, it was still sort of a patchwork of laws to figure out what was going to happen. But certainly, even after, even after they arrived in Illinois, there was the reverse Underground Railroad. People were still snatching even free people who'd never been enslaved and bringing them back to the South. So had Shadrach won, and had he had a valid probate decree upholding his ownership of Lucy and her family, he certainly could have sent someone up there as a bounty hunter to grab them and bring them back. He would have had a greater chance of enforcing that than many white people who just stole people and took them. We've seen, what was the movie? Solomon Northrop, the
12 Years a Slave.
12 Years a Slave. That was all about the reverse Underground Railroad, snatching people. And so I believe that had Shadrach won, and perhaps even if he hadn't won, if he'd really wanted to do it, or if they had still been in Florida, he probably would have tried to figure out a way to take control of them, because he seemed to be a terrible person from what I could tell.
Now, were you able in your research to discover what Lucy's life and her 8 children, what that life was like in Illinois?
So we know some information about what their life was like in Illinois. Obviously, it wasn't official legal slavery as we had in Jacksonville or anywhere in the South. But Illinois was a funny place. Legally, technically, slavery was prohibited. However, salt was desperately needed in Illinois, and they had salt mines, which was really a terrible, terrible place to work. But they actually allowed slavery to exist in Illinois so that they would have somebody that they could force to go into the salt mines to mine salt. In fact, there was one man named John Crenshaw, who was a white man who was sort of the head of the reverse Underground Railroad in southern Illinois. His home was in Equality, Illinois, of all ironic, terrible places. There's still a building in Equality, Illinois. They call it the Old Slave House, where they actually hosted parties and events. Abraham Lincoln, as a young candidate for congressional office, actually spent time there. They would have parties and events, and they would also keep slaves that they had stolen or free people that they had stolen upstairs on the third floor, and they would breed them, and just terrible, awesome, awful things. So this was Southern Illinois. This was the world that Lucy and her family went to. There were a lot of things that were so much better. They were able to establish their lives. This is 20 years before the end of the Civil War, and as a result of my family being there, they became, there was a community of Black people who all found their way together in Polk County, Illinois, and they resisted as much as they could the influence of the white people who were around them, who didn't have a whole lot of warmth for them. As I said, they had to post a bond lest they become burdens on the people of the state of Florida if they were freed there. When you got to Illinois, they had to post a bond. Each one of them had to post a $1,000 bond, lest they become burdens on the people of the state of Illinois.
Where'd they get that money from?
Probably the cost of a bond is probably some percentage of the actual cost. The $1,000 bond, maybe it's $2 to $5 or something per person. But they each had to post them, and they're actually recorded in Southern Illinois for down to the little 14-month-old toddler. They all had to have a bond posted in order for them to be able to stay. And those were the kinds of things that people were living under in terms of their experience, and even in free states, because there was still suspicion and hatred and racism, just as there had been in the South, which is not legal.
So as you do this research, was there any particular character, any of Lucy's 8 children or the 6 grandchildren that became of particular interest to you?
Well, one in particular was Sarah. Sarah was Lucy's youngest daughter. She was 17 in 1846 when they escaped from slavery. I have a picture of her somewhere from the early 1900s. So, by that time she was in her 80s or 90s. And she looks like a old white lady. So I'm sure in 1846 she looked like a 17-year-old white girl. And I think sometimes people are sort of, it causes people to stop and rethink about the idea of race and slavery and these concepts that are so bizarre in how they function. But because Sarah was my great-great-great-grandmother, I have sort of a special interest and connection to her, and I sort of follow her story in particular. And as we tell the narrative of the Lucy story, as we framed it, the whole family makes it to Illinois. But Shadrach snatches Sarah and goes back to the South with her. And Lucy, because she's frustrated with these laws that have left her in this position, she kind of goes back almost on her own, following her white half-brother who's returned there, because she's determined to make sure that Sarah can escape from slavery. So the two of them are there in the middle of this will contest as the property with no ability to speak for themselves, and yet this trial is going on over their heads that's going to control their destiny and where they're going to end up.
So what happens to Sarah ultimately? Does she remain a slave of Shadrach?
So in our story, ultimately, Judge Crabtree still does bang his gavel and still does uphold the will and find that it's valid. And so Lucy and Sarah are able to return to Illinois and be with the family. And since it played out that they were already in Illinois, we don't have to worry about how that turned out for them in reality. But the fact is that Sarah, in real life, Sarah married another free person who had come from Tennessee, and these two families, and we've done research on his family as well, and he was owned by a very an abolitionist-minded white man who owned, I think, 30 or 40 slaves, and his will provided that all of his people were to be set free, and there was supposed to be money provided for them to go and set up a life for themselves. So Sarah Sutton had the good fortune of marrying, I can't think of his name, George, it'll come to me later on, and they had children, and we're in Southern Illinois, and we're able to establish a life of freedom among a Black community in Southern Illinois.
So did any one of the Suttons, any of Lucy's children, I've been doing some work myself around the Black-white wealth gap and looking at communities outside of Tulsa during the late 1800s that were prosperous, where Black folks owned businesses, where they, created wealth that was ultimately destroyed as it was in Tulsa. Did this community that you've been describing, was that one of those communities like a Tulsa? And
it was small town farmers, and so there was a strong Black community. I think the Second Baptist Church that's there, the building isn't the same building, but it was established, I think, in the 1850s, and so this community that was there and still is there is a thriving community, mostly farmers. Of course, over time, as farming has become less economically viable, and I have a friend, Natalie Bazil, who wrote a book about Black farmers and the challenges that they've had to face. Mm-hmm. I think people have generally left the area largely, but there was a substantial thriving community of Black folk in Polk County and that whole area of Southern Illinois.
Were you able to determine if your family were they prosperous? Did they create wealth as it was defined in that period?
Yeah, they were successful farmers. We have some information from later on, I think the 1870s. There was an article in the newspaper about there was a white man who brought some kind of a pump that he was trying to sell and encourage people to use there, that caused this tremendous explosion that killed several people in the community, some Black people, some white people, because it was an interesting sort of community that still had influences of white and Black people there. And, my family were farmers, and they were successful and had their property there, and were affected by this traumatic event in 1873 when there was this huge boiler that exploded. So we can sort of track some of those aspects of the family's growth and prosperity, and it resulted in the fact that many of them were able to go to school and to support themselves and to become productive members of society, and those are my relatives who are still around today.
Wow. So I know, Terry, you've been telling this story of Lucy Sutton and her children, her grandchildren, and, your ancestors through a couple of different mediums. You've had a very, very successful TED Talk. Tell us, how else have you been getting this story out to the public?
Right. So what I've discovered is that my mission is to bend the arc of history towards justice by telling the story many ways, any way I can, really. As you said, I just had a chance to do it at a TED Talk in Davenport, Iowa. But I'm also working with a couple of co-writers, including one of them who's my husband, and one's a co-writer, John Meeks, on a limited series for television called The Last Will of Lucy Sutton, that tells the family story from beginning to end, and it's really the next in a line of stories like Sojourner Truths or Ida B. Wells, and down to Ketanji Brown Jackson, of Black women using the only tool that they know that a white man might be bound to respect, another white man's laws, to claim protection and an entitlement for their own family's rights. So that's what The Last Will of Lucy Sutton's story is. It's about this weird relationship that we can't quite wrap our heads around that caused John to set them free. And it's about the story of how Lucy has mentors that she finds along the way. And there's all these Black women whose stories we've uncovered who really existed, who Lucy might actually have had contact with. Anna Magagini Jai Kingsley was one of the wealthiest women in Florida, who was a former slave, who was, again, married to a white man who, but he set her up and left her property and left her entitlement and the ability to control her fate. And after he died, his white family challenged his will, and she had to come back to the States from Haiti and fight for her ability to control her property. The same judge who was in her case was the judge in our case.
Wow.
So in our story, we weave those two together, and Lucy gets advice from Anna. So that's one of our stories. Is The Last Will of Lucy Sutton is a limited series for TV. We also are working on a collaboration with the Oakland Symphony Chorus, where we're creating music called the Lucy Sutton Suite. It's about a 15-20-minute program of pieces that include essentially a closing argument for love. It's a lawyer who's telling this story about Lucy's determination to make sure that her family would make it to freedom. And ultimately, what is it that, it includes a little bit of a rap, what was it that Lucy did to lead her family to freedom? How was it that Lucy could bear what she'd borne? What was it drove a woman to make a man make a move for freedom? What was it got that will marked by John? It's Lucy's determination to make sure that her family is going to make it to freedom. So we have that project. There's also a documentary project where we followed the family of Lucy and from Jacksonville up to Savannah, where they board boats, went around Florida, through the tip of Florida, through New Orleans, up the Mississippi to Illinois, where they claimed their freedom. Mm-hmm. And along the way, we'll be talking to Black people and white people and other people about where we are now, right, and where we were then. We have access to Shadrach's descendants, and we have access to William Adams, Lucy's white half-brother's descendants. And so we'd like to talk to them and engage with them about what race is in America and about how we can try to move forward.
Does your family have any relationship with Lucy's half-brother's descendants?
We don't have any relationship with them. We reached out to a couple of women who are actually members of the Daughters of the Confederacy and Daughters of the American Revolution as well, who are my aunts, essentially. So we've had some exchange. So I'm looking forward to re-engaging with them when we do this documentary project and we get a chance to travel back there. So that's happening. There's a novel that I've been working on that's probably about 3/4 of the way done with that. And then a memoir that I've been working on called An Archbender's Journal. It's about how we can all try to bend the arc of history towards justice by finding ways to empower ourselves to claim our rights to be here and to look out for the future of those who come after us.
And you're doing all of this in the midst of being a named partner at a very busy and successful litigation firm in Los Angeles, and your dad. So your plate is obviously full. A couple last things I want to ask you, Terry, is these stories can be so traumatizing. Just listening to, a 15-year-old girl who gets sold to a white man that rapes her so many times that they have 8 children. She has 8 children. And you told us how your younger cousin responded to using the last name Sutton, that government name Sutton, as a part of your family reunion. How have the women in your family responded and to what you've uncovered? As on one hand, as positive as it is to know your ancestors, it can also be very traumatizing to hear those stories.
Yeah, I think it can be traumatizing. I think the women in my family, I think, have generally tried to do what I think women do when they hear these stories, is to situate themselves with an understanding of that context of what happened then and how these things could happen. I sort of had some exchanges with Annette Gordon-Reed, who's done so much work with Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and she and I I've read how she tries to grapple with an understanding of the contemporary realities that people lived with, and how we have to somehow recognize how different the times are today than they were then, and to recognize that the same kind of I guess, inspiration and energy that we feel from watching those experiences, how we can transform that into something that empowers us today, empowers women today, that says, that's a terrible, terrible situation that those people faced. Let's bring our frustration and anger and a need for change to this moment and look around to the places where there's oppression and violence and and hostility, and animate ourselves and motivate ourselves to change this for the future. It's trying to turn poison into medicine. We Buddhists talk about turning poison into medicine, and I don't know what the answer is other than therapy and working through it. But I think if we can try to remember that maybe there are ways, energy is just energy. Can we transform something negative into something positive?
Wow. Well, you are a busy man, and I thank you for going on this journey and taking us on this journey and uncovering this history. And I know so many people want to do what you've done and talk about, traveling to the South to find out about the stories, their origin stories, really is what we're talking about. And there are these, online apps and different software that people can use to trace their ancestors. But you've gone next level, not just the DNA tracing, but actually going and finding these legal documents and finding out the stories of these amazing people in your story and in your family, and then sharing the stories with us. And we're so grateful to you for doing that, and can't wait to see some of these projects hit the big screens, the television screen, the bookshelves, and best of luck to you. How can we find you and follow you as you continue to work on these various projects?
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for helping to bend the arc. As I say, every time I share the story, we are bending that arc of history towards justice. So yeah, you can follow me on Instagram at Terry Franklin. I'm on Twitter at Terry Franklin LA. There's the www.lucysutton.com, where we try to keep people apprised of the latest developments. There's a Last Will of Lucy Sutton Facebook page. I'll post information and videos as we travel around. And there's also a podcast called The Last Will of Lucy Sutton, where I tell bits and pieces of this story, and we'll be adding in some bits and pieces of the music and other aspects. So yeah, follow along. And next year we're supposed to go on tour with the Oakland Symphony Chorus on a tour of the southern United States as part of their Mass for Freedom tour. So follow along. I can't wait to have everybody bend the arc of history with me. I actually have the original documents. I was fortunate that lawyers went to court, and the judge who gave me ownership told the story about the clerk who loaded a bunch of files on a boat in the Jackson and saved them from the fire. So that's my destiny. Thank you for giving me the chance.
And who would have thought, from your choice of trust and estate litigation, would come these historical gems that you have unearthed. Wow. All right. Thanks, Harvard.
Thank you, Harvard.
Thank you, Harvard. Gave us something that we can use, right?
Exactly.
Again, good to sit down with you, my friend, and best of luck. I'm going to go to all those places you told us to go and follow you and follow the story of Lucy. Fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff.
Thank you. Thank you for all you do, Areva.
You're welcome, my friend. I want to thank my good friend Terry Franklin, for joining me this morning and sharing the incredible story of Lucy Sutton, her children, her grandchildren, and that fascinating legal story. How ironic that Terry would be a trust and estates litigator and find himself in the middle of a piece of litigation involving the estate of John Sutton. Boy, you couldn't have scripted that, even if you tried too. I am so excited for Terry and the future projects involving Lucy Sutton. I can't wait to see the documentary, read his memoir, read his novel, and just follow him as he goes on this journey back to the South to learn more about Lucy, her legacy, her resilience. And as Terry said, this is not just the story of Lucy and her children and the story of Terry's family. This is a Black story. This is a story of resilience. This is a story of Black women, Black families. And often we don't hear these stories. So many of them have been erased from our history. And when we do hear them, they're often sanitized. So bravo to my friend Terry Franklin for having the courage, for having the tenacity and the perseverance to go on this journey and to tell this story of Lucy Sutton. Make sure you follow him on Facebook. Make sure you follow him on Instagram, on Twitter, that you join the conversation and that you help support the work that he's doing. And, you might get inspired yourself to go on a similar journey to learn more about your ancestors, because we know, and these are my words to live by, when we learn about the past, we gather strength for the future. Be safe out there, and remember, we are all in this together.